So in the lecture video, in the first part of this sort of lecture series, I kind of left off with this idea of rhetoric salvation and how this discourse around women's oppression and women's liberation, specifically liberation of Muslim women, was used to justify war. And so I want to kind of bring that to a more specific example of the war in Afghanistan. And the ways in which Muslim women were used by the U.S. government as a way to justify going to war. And where I want to start off is with this address to the nation by Laura Bush in 2001, because it's really kind of a classic example of how this discourse of liberation and this rhetoric of salvation got used to justify war. And so in 2001, she gave an address to the nation to garner public support for the war in Afghanistan, which we went after 9/11. And, you know, she's using all kinds of language within this address to the nation, things like referring to people in the United States, for example, as civilized people or civilized people throughout the war, and as the Taliban as people who want to impose their world on the rest of us, so kind of constructing the other as a threat. And she specifically used the suffering of women and children as in Afghanistan a justification for war. So, for example, she said, because of our recent military gains in much of in Afghanistan, women are no longer imprisoned in their homes. They can listen to music and teach their daughters without fear or punishment. The fight against terrorism is also a fight for the rights and dignity of women. So you can see here that she's really conflating war with women's liberation. That somehow by going into Afghanistan and bombing the land and homes of the people that they're trying to save, that they are somehow saving them. And this is problematic for a couple reasons. One, it's that kind of whole rhetoric of salvation that reduces, that's culturally racist, and it reduces complex structural issues to religion and culture. So women's oppression, and to be clear, there were real oppressive policies and practices in Afghanistan at this time towards women, but rather than constructing it as an issue of the state, it became constructed as an issue of religion and culture. And that's even more problematic coming from the United States because discourse such as what was used in Laura Bush's address to the nation completely erases the role that the United States played in implementing those policies and practices into Afghanistan. And that's the element that I want to focus on here because it really kind of speaks to how the geopolitical relationships and economic and political factors feed into intercultural conflict. So I'm going to give you a little bit of historical background on how oppressive policies in Afghanistan, such as the requirement to wear the burqa, came to be and what the U.S. Role was in that. But before we do that, I would like you to pause the video here and complete exercise 7.1 before continuing on with the lecture. So now that you have kind of taken a chance to do a little discourse analysis around gender and how that kind of got used to, how that gets used in this kind of Orientalist way, I now want to provide some historical background on how certain policies, such as the requirement to wear the burqa, came to be implemented in Afghanistan. And to do this, we're going to go back to the 1970s and 1980s and the Cold War. So the Cold War was a war between the United States and the Soviet Union. And the big discourse around this time was communism. That communism was this threat to American way of life, and we had to do everything that we could to protect our land from the communist threat. And Afghanistan kind of found themselves in the middle of this in the late 1970s and into the 1980s. In April 1978, the president, Daud Khan Mohammed, was deposed and killed by army officers who supported the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, or the PDPA, which was a communist party. And the PDPA began instituting reforms, but because they didn't have the social base of like the public, because of how they took power, a group of conservative Islamic groups were able to join forces under the name of Mujahideen, which translates into holy warriors, and together they launched a resistance against the PDPA. In December of 1979, the Soviet Union went into Afghanistan to support the PDPA, and in 1980, the CIA officially reported that it went in to Afghanistan to support the Mujahideen. They started sending in resources. So you have these two sides of this kind of civil war within Afghanistan. You have the U.S. and the USSR kind of coming in and getting involved. And the CIA, the U.S., kind of officially reported that they went in 1980. However, 18 years later, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was National Security Advisor to President Carter at the time, he gives this interview with Le Nouvel Observateur, which is a French news publication, and he says the following. He says, according to the official version of history, CIA aid to the Mujahideen began during 1980. That is to say, after the Soviet Union Army invaded Afghanistan in December of 1979. But the reality, secretly guarded until now, is completely otherwise. Indeed, it was July 3rd, 1979, that President Carter signed the first directive for secret aid to opponents of the pro-Soviet regime in Kabul. And that very day, I wrote a note to the president in which I explained to him that in my opinion, this was going to induce a Soviet military intervention. The day that the day that the Soviets officially crossed the border, I wrote to President Carter, we now have the opportunity of giving to the USSR its Vietnam War. So essentially, Brzezinski, who was again the National Security Advisor to Carter during this time, admitted that the official reports of the CIA were false, and that they actually went into Afghanistan not only several months earlier than they had originally said, but they went in before the USSR went in, before the Soviet Union went in. So just for an adjusted timeline, in 1978, we have the assassination of Daud Khan Mohammed and the rise of the conservative Islamic Mujahideen. And then it was July of 1979, not 1980, that President Carter signs off on aid to the Mujahideen. And then later, several months later, in December 1979, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. So really what this wasn't the Soviet Union just kind of going in to support Afghanistan, but rather this was a U.S. strategy to draw the USSR into a protracted war, to sow internal dissent and to divert resources. So it was basically setting up a proxy war to kind of distract them, and so that they would kind of deplete their resources on this proxy war. And the Mujahideen and the U.S. support of them become really important in understanding kind of current policies towards women in Afghanistan. In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan becomes elected, and he praises the Mujahideen. He calls them heroes and people that, we need to support. We need to put all our weight up behind because they're fighting the good fight against communism. And so the U.S., with the help of Pakistani intelligence, they start sending U.S. military weapons to the Mujahideen. And they set up these training camps, both within Afghanistan and in Pakistan, training the Mujahideen in U.S. military combat and U.S. military tactics. So they received a lot of money and weapons and other forms of training from the U.S. government. And there's some notable alumni to come out of these training camps, one of which is the Taliban, who would later come into power in Afghanistan and implement the very policies that Laura Bush was trying to encourage people to go to war against in 2001. But another notable alumni to come out of these camps was Osama Bin Laden. He was trained by the U.S. government, and it was in these camps that he was able to form the connections to form Al-Qaeda. So Al-Qaeda grew from these training camps that were being funded and resourced by the U.S. government. And so what happens is that in 1989, the Soviet Union is defeated and withdraws from Afghanistan. And Afghanistan was devastated by this, economically, politically, infrastructurally. 10 years of war in one location like this is going to completely devastate the area. And so Afghanistan was in a lot of turmoil and experiencing a lot of instability. And so in the early 1990s, the Mujahideen parties began taking power in Afghanistan and establishing religious decrees that significantly changed the position of women in the area. And in 1996, the Taliban came into power. And so before the Taliban came into power, it's important to kind of give a little bit of context here. Up until the early 1990s, large numbers of women participated in the workforce. The 1964 Constitution ensured basic rights such as the right to vote and equal pay. Girls in Kabul and other cities were allowed to attend school, and half of university students were women. They also comprised 40% of doctors, 70% of teachers, and 30% of civil servants. And most women did not wear a burqa. The photo on the right is actually a fashion advertisement in Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan. And while the burqa did exist, it was really kind of in smaller locations like the Pashtun region, which was kind of like one kind of community of women that wore it. And even their reasons for wearing it wasn't so much force. There's a long, complex history that I don't have time to get into there. But once the Taliban came into power, we started seeing changes. And they implemented 4 central policies that really significantly changed women's experiences in the area. Women were now forbidden to hold jobs. They could not attend school until an appropriate curriculum had been developed. Women had to wear burqas, so they were now required, and the photo on the right is of a burqa. And men had to wear shalwar kameez, which is kind of like a robe, and they were required to grow a beard, and they weren't allowed to style their hair. And women could only leave their home with male relatives and had to avoid contact with male strangers. And the United States was well aware that this was happening. They knew that the Taliban was implementing these changes, and they were okay with it. They were complicit because they were developing very close relationships with the Taliban because Afghanistan had oil. And so the United States wanted to secure a contract for a company, Uniqlo, I believe it was called, that wanted to construct an underground oil pipeline in the area. So not only was this kind of a proxy war with the Soviet Union, but this was a way to, it was political globalization. It was implementing a government that's going to be amenable to you and to your agendas so that you can gain economically. It's a really kind of good example of how economic, political, and cultural globalization kind of come together. And women's position within Afghanistan was significantly changed as a result. And so the reason that I go through this here is to get you all thinking about how something like Islamophobia and hate crimes against Muslim people in the United States and a lot of the hateful and discourse that exists around Islam has its roots really in the determining edge. And that's what Sorrells is trying to get you to think about with her multidimensional framework for understanding intercultural conflict. To not just see it as an individual level, but to be able to kind of scale it back and look at the macro level factors that feed into the interpersonal. So that concludes the lecture. I'd like you to, before ending, to complete exercise 7.2. And as always, please let me know if you have any questions about the content. Thank you.